In the year 1337, a conflict began that would stretch across 5 generations of kings, knights, and peasants. Alike a war so long, so bitter, and so transformative that it would not only shape the destinies of England and France, but leave permanent scars on Europe's soul. The 100 Years' War did not begin with fire or fury, but with a claim, a challenge to the throne of France. Edward III, King of England, believed he had a rightful claim to the French crown through his mother, Isabella, the daughter of Philip the Fair of France, but the French nobles disagreed, citing an ancient custom known as Salic law, which prevented inheritance through the female line. They instead crowned Philip VI of the House of Valois, thus denying Edward's bloodline and awakening the fury of a king scorned. What followed was not just a war between monarchs, but a war between identities, between two nations desperate to assert dominance, legacy, and pride. The early years of the war belonged to England, thanks in large part to the strategic genius of Edward III and his mastery of military innovation. The English longbow, a weapon both humble and devastating, turned battles into slaughterhouses, as it did at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where Edward's small army stood against a massive French force and emerged victorious. Arrows fell like iron rain, tearing through armor and flesh, reducing the flower of French nobility to corpses in the mud. It was not only a military triumph, but a transformation in warfare, where the strength of the common archer could shatter the might of mounted knights. The victory at Crécy was followed by the siege of Calais, which lasted nearly a year until the starving city surrendered in 1347, giving England a critical port that would serve as a vital bridge to the continent for generations. Then came the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where Edward's son, known as the Black Prince, led another outnumbered English army to an astonishing victory, capturing King John II of France and taking him to England as a prisoner. This humiliation forced France to sign the Treaty of Bretigny, which granted England vast territories and wealth in exchange for a fragile peace. But peace in this era was always temporary, and France slowly recovered under Charles V, a wise and calculating king who avoided large-scale battles and instead relied on attrition and harassment, sending out guerrilla forces to recapture lost lands bit by bit. French commander Bertrand du Guesclin led these efforts, turning the tide of war without ever risking a pitched battle, reclaiming French pride one village at a time. By the late 14th century, the English position in France was weakening, their resources stretched, their armies tired, and their people growing weary of a war without end. But just as France regained ground, a new English king rose with fire in his heart and conquest in his eyes. Henry V, remembered not only for his lineage but for his ruthless brilliance, took up the sword in 1415 and led an invasion of France that would etch his name in glory forever. The Battle of Agincourt became his masterpiece, fought in the mud on St. Crispin's Day with his men outnumbered and surrounded by French knights. The battlefield was narrow, the soil soaked with rain, and the French heavy with armor, but Henry's longbowmen, positioned behind sharpened stakes, turned the terrain into a trap. Arrows cut through the air like thunder, and the advancing French were slaughtered in droves, their pride and bodies buried beneath the mire. Henry's victory at Agincourt wasn't just a battle won, it was a legacy carved in blood and steel. It gave him the strength to force the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a document that named him the heir to the French crown and granted him marriage to Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the mentally ill French King Charles VI. In that moment, Henry stood as the future king of both England and France, but fate is cruel and destiny rarely follows the designs of men. Just 2 years later, Henry died of illness, leaving behind a baby son, and a kingdom suddenly fractured. The child Henry VI was crowned both King of England and King of France, but he was too young to rule and too weak to command, and thus the dream of a united crown began to unravel as swiftly as it had formed. The war had now stretched nearly a century, yet its fire burned hotter than ever. The early victories that had once seemed to promise an English empire were fading into bitter memories as France rallied and prepared for a final resurrection. The 100 Years' War had become more than politics or dynasties. It had become a symbol of national struggle, a mirror in which each country saw its future heroes, martyrs, and purpose. The first great act of this war was coming to a close, but the next chapter would bring new voices, new blood, and a spark that would ignite French resistance like never before. As the crown of France rested uneasily on the infant head of Henry VI, the once unstoppable English tide began to ebb, and the fire that had once illuminated their path to glory began to flicker in the wind of rising French resistance. For a time, England attempted to hold its grip on French soil through a web of regents, loyalists, and alliances. But the kingdom itself had grown weary of war, exhausted of coin and spirit, while France, though battered, had not been broken. In this climate of uncertainty and division, a voice rose not from palaces or councils, but from the heart of a peasant girl whose visions would change history forever. Her name was Joan of Arc, a 17-year-old from Domremy who claimed divine instruction to lift the siege of Orleans and crown Charles VII as the true king of France. Clad in armor yet driven by faith, Joan stepped onto the battlefield not as a general, but as a symbol, and the French rallied to her like moths to flame. In 1429, she led the charge at Orleans, breaking the English siege and revitalizing a broken nation. Charles was crowned at Reims with Joan by his side, and for a moment France dared to hope again. But hope is fragile and power makes enemies. Where faith once stood, Joan was captured by Burgundian allies of the English and handed over to her enemies, where she was tried for heresy, witchcraft, and the sin of wearing men's clothing. She was burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. Her body turned to ash, but her legacy, cast in iron, Joan of Arc became more than a martyr. She became the heart of France, and her death only steeled the resolve of her countrymen. Charles VII, now emboldened by divine favor, reorganized his army, introduced reforms, and worked to centralize royal power, while the English fractured under the weak and increasingly unstable rule of Henry VI. England's strength abroad was undermined by chaos at home. Noble factions plotted, civil war loomed, and the once proud gains in France were being lost one city at a time. Normandy crumbled, Gascony slipped through their fingers, and even the once impregnable Calais began to feel the weight of time. The final blow came in 1453 with the fall of Bordeaux, the last major English possession in France, bringing the curtain down on over a century of bloodshed. The 100 Years' War had ended not with a treaty, but with a quiet retreat, the thunder of war replaced by the whisper of change. But though the swords were sheathed, the consequences of the war were irreversible. France emerged wounded, but stronger, its monarchy more centralized, and its people forged in fire with a sense of national identity that had not existed before. England, meanwhile, turned inward, falling into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that would plunge the country into decades of instability and redefine its own royal lineage. The war had also transformed warfare itself. Gone were the days when knights in shining armor dominated the field, replaced by professional armies. Gunpowder weapons and the long reach of taxation and bureaucracy, the feudal world had cracked under the pressure of 100 years of battle, giving rise to modern states, standing armies, and the slow death of the medieval order. The 100 Years' War taught rulers that power came not only from birthright, but from effective governance strategy and at times the voice of the common people. It also reminded the world that borders are often drawn not with ink, but with blood etched across generations who lived and died for flags they barely understood. For the men and women who lived through the war, its horror was not poetic, it was personal. The burned villages, the starvation, the loss of sons to foreign soil, these were not tales of glory, but scars on the soul of Europe. Mothers buried children under shattered cathedrals. Monks scribbled prayers while the walls crumbled around them, and in the silence after battles, the only sounds were the crows circling over the fallen, Yet from this darkness came a new dawn. The 100 Years' War was not just a war of crowns, it was the war that awakened nations and forced kings to become rulers, not just warriors. It forged heroes and peasants, saints and girls and kings and boys, and when it ended, it left behind more than peace, it left behind purpose. France would never be the same, and neither would England, and though the two nations would clash again, they would do so now as nations aware of their identity, shaped by a war that had forced them to grow or perish, the ghost of 100 years. War lingered long in the songs of soldiers, in the ruins of once proud towns, and in the coronation halls that echoed with names like Edward, Henry, Charles, and Joan. But the world that rose from its ashes was a world that had learned to endure, to rebuild, and to remember.